All right. Last week we began Revelation chapter 6, and this is the opening of the six seals that are seen back in chapter 5. The Lamb takes the scroll or the book from the hand of Jehovah who sits on the throne in heaven. He takes the scroll, and of course the scroll is sealed with seven seals. We talk about that scroll or that book containing the plan of God. Okay, the full plan. That's all the plan of God. Basically, it's the plan of God that he had ordained before the foundation of the world, as Paul mentions in Ephesians 1 and Colossians 1, to bring his creation into harmony or into that which is holy back to his presence. Okay, bringing his creation to heaven, being his creation being those with souls, that be mankind, those who have been faithful and righteous into heaven. And the opening of the first six seals is found, as we read earlier, we noticed the first three seals last week. But we noticed how that the four living creatures are calling John, they're inviting John to come and see what happens with the opening of each seal. And each seal represents an event. Something takes place, and the imagery associated with it, these are associated directly with the purpose of Revelation. Remember, we talked before, going all the way back to Revelation 1, that Revelation isn't written to the world, it's written specifically to the servants of God. They're the only ones who are going to understand what's being written. They're the only ones who are going to receive any benefit from understanding what's being said. That being the case, all of Revelation is a letter written from Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit to the faithful to remind them to be faithful unto death. That they're going to suffer great persecution, but God's going to bring to judgment those who persecute them. Their job is not to seek vengeance. It's not to seek justice for themselves. It's to maintain their faith, even to the point of death. That's their purpose. That's their job. God's going to take care of the rest. And that's the whole purpose of Revelation is to that end. And to give the saints something to look forward to. We have glimpses of what heaven is going to be like at the end of Revelation. What all of this is leading to. I mean, is it going to be worth it? Is all this pain and strife going to be worth it? And God answers that for them in the visions given to John. Well, here the first seal that is open in verse 2, a white horse appears, and he who sits on it, there is one who he has a bow, he has a crown that was given to him, and he goes out conquering and to conquer. And we noted in connection with Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 16, the identity of this writer, and remember the consistency of imagery in Revelation is very consistent, is Jesus. That this is Jesus, and his gospel is what's going to be going out to conquer. We talked about a bow, and the precision and the necessity for skill in the use of that. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is going to be precise. It is directly aimed at the heart and the soul of individuals. That's its purpose. Paul describes the fact that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty. They're in pulling down strongholds, the strongholds of the mind, not of the flesh. It is never the purpose of the Christian to wage physical warfare against those who are not faithful. And that's a key component of the false god Allah compared to Jehovah, is that Jehovah never calls his servants to wage physical warfare in his name. Never to destroy the infidels or non-believers. The gospel is meant for that purpose. It's meant to bring down the strongholds of the mind, the strongholds of the heart. And we're not to take action towards people who refuse to listen. God will do that through judgment one day. And so the idea of conquering, remember we talked about in Revelation 4 the term throne and how that it comes up so often in Revelation. Conquer or conquering also comes up multiple times in Revelation as well. I mean, there's a theme with regard to the throne, authority, and power, and the concept of conquering, of overcoming, of victory. And certainly Jesus and his gospel is ultimately the one that is victorious. And then verse 3 and 4, we have the second seal that was opened or released as Jesus is opening up this book of God's plan. And we see in verse 4 a fiery red horse goes out, and it says, it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. And we talked about this sword in verse 4, and the concept of there's some people who suggest that this is war. Okay, well, it's not necessarily war itself, but specific to what's going to happen as a result of the opening of the first seal, which is the spreading of the gospel. And Jesus himself acknowledges in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34 that he didn't come to bring peace on earth, but what? A sword. Not that Jesus is encouraging violence, but rather he knew full well that the teaching of the gospel, what he brought, was going to set people at odds against one another. And it wasn't going to be his people, the Christians, who were going to be instigating violence or instigating conflict, but rather people who were at odds with what he wanted, people who were at odds with the gospel. They were not going to like what they were hearing. Because again, this didn't just trample on physical feet, it trampled on hearts, it trampled on minds. And as a result, people were going to get angry. And we've noted before how that, everything that happened to Jesus happened because of heightened, uncontrolled anger. And people refusing to listen, people refusing to consider God's word. They simply reacted in anger. And in Acts chapter 5 with Stephen, the same thing happened. They literally stopped their ears because they refused to hear anything else. They were made so mad by the things that Stephen was saying, or that Stephen said, that they just couldn't take it anymore. And they stoned him. And for them to become that angry and of their own accord, without any permission whatsoever from Rome, which they made a great big deal about doing with Jesus, they practiced capital punishment on Stephen. And so here in verse 4, the idea of taking peace from the earth is the fact that Jesus knew full well that the conquering of the gospel in its wake is going to be left people who are going to hate Christians. And so there's going to be persecution. Now, God's going to allow that persecution to take place. Not cause it, okay, other than indirectly through the teaching of the gospel. God's not going to cause people to reject the gospel. God wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, Paul told Timothy. But here in verse 4, there's the understanding that there's going to be great persecution, there's going to be great conflict as a result of the teaching of the gospel. And then the third seal, and as we ended last week, we were talking about this third seal here in verse 5 and 6 with this black horse. And the rider has a pair of scales in his hand, or a pair of balances. And it was used to convey weight to value, or ounces to value in terms of what's going to be sold. We talked last week about the fact that there are many rebukes in the Old Testament about unfair balances or unfair weights. And it's those who fiddled with the weights to trick people into paying more than they needed to for whatever it was, food or whatever. Well, here in verse 5, we have this rider who has these balances in his hand. And in verse 6, specifically is mentioned, we have two things in contrast with one another. We've got very important staples of the time. We've got barley and wheat in verse 6, and then we've also got oil and wine. Now, oil and wine were the more luxurious staple items. These are things that the rich always maintained. The poor had great difficulty in acquiring them, or often had difficulty in acquiring them, because they were more luxurious. They were more expensive of the four things being described. Wheat was a much more filling component, therefore it cost a little bit more, which is why you have the difference of a quart of wheat versus 3 quarts of barley. Barley was much cheaper, and you could basically obtain more in terms of that. But then describing this, I think the King James says for a penny. The term is denarius, and as we talked about last week, this is a full day's wage. Okay, so the cost and expense of an individual, and I read some more on this, did a little bit more studying on this, a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley was enough for one person to be filled for a day. Okay, so one individual could survive on a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley. It did not take into account a wife or children, family. Didn't take into account that. It's only that one individual. So basically, what's being described is, for my whole day's wage, what am I able to accomplish? I can survive by myself for a day with, this is just food. Okay. This isn't taking into account the equivalents of rent or mortgage or clothing or anything else. Okay, this is just survival. Barely, we would call this barely surviving. Okay, if that. And again, just for that individual. This is not for a full family. All right, and so the great difficulty associated with that versus do not harm the oil and the wine. The term harm here means do not be unjust. Do no wrong. Okay, that's the term. I went back and looked at this term a little bit because the concept of harm or damage, as one translation has, it makes you wonder, well, what exactly does that mean with regard to the oil and the wine? Well, in context of the scales, okay, do not be unjust with the oil and the wine. So what's being adjusted here is the wheat and barley. What's not to be adjusted, what's not to be caused to make difficult in terms of purchasing is the oil and the wine. And again, I noted before that there are some of the commentators specifically address this as economic issues, economic trial and hardship for Christians. And as we noted, we definitely do see that. We see evidence of that with the churches of Asia, how that many of them were going to deal with great trial because in order to do business in their societies, they had to in some form compromise their faith. A lot of these societies, in order to do business, you had to be associated with sacrifices or offering up some kind of homage or incense or something to the gods of Greece and Rome. And associated with that, therefore, would be the compromising of the faith of the Christian who refuses to do that. Well, if I'm not going to compromise my faith, I can't do business. They're going to basically shun me from doing business. And some of them might lose their job. Some of them might lose their means to support themselves and their families. And certainly we do see evidence of that. So at the very least, I think that is absolutely there. I mentioned last week, though, that I wonder, though, if this is a little bit even broader than that in the sense of the testing, again, those balances. And I can see the literal aspect of the economic hardship here. But again, we're talking about this contrast of those who are true, faithful Christians, unwilling to compromise in any way their faith, versus not just the world, but maybe Christians who were willing to compromise their faith. And we see evidence in some of the churches of Asia that there were some brethren who did compromise their faith. And we noticed in Matthew chapter 13, 20 and 21, how that the parable of the sower and the seed that was sown on the stony places, these are individuals who heard the word, they received it, and for a time were faithful until hardship and persecution arose. And then they just kind of fell over. And so I wonder if, even more broadly than just the economic consideration, is all of that pertaining to the Christian and the weighing of the heart, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're focused on being faithful, focused on doing what they're supposed to be doing, and not compromising themselves to the oil and wine, so to speak, of the world, of the luxuries, of the sins that are presented by the world. And so in I guess, in that perspective, you would kind of view the wheat and the barley as focusing on the faith, focusing at the great cost of being faithful, the great cost of remaining uncompromised in character, versus those who are willing to compromise in order to gain the oil and the wine, in order to have those luxuries of life. And so they're willing to compromise, whether it's economic or any other way, because of persecution. Thoughts or comments to that? And again, all of these kind of build on one another. Okay, now these are not defined in terms of time frames. These are defined in terms of action and consequence, so to speak. Because the gospel is taught, persecution arises. Because persecution arises, the saints are then tested. All right, and then as we go into verse 7, we see the fourth seal being opened. And again, John is invited by another one of the four creatures. Again, whether or not there's any connection to which of the four creatures is inviting John to see, I've seen commentaries that have tried to make that connection, and I've even, on my notes, I associated, if we're talking in order, which one of these would be associated with which. But the fact that the Holy Spirit doesn't specify, the fact that John doesn't specify, I'm not going to put a whole lot of connection there into which of the four creatures is saying this, because it doesn't really matter. In verse 8, here's the fourth seal. Behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Now, this term pale is kind of an interesting term because, ironically, almost everywhere else, the term is translated green. Here's translated pale. What do you think the meaning of that? Yes, ma'am? Ashen, okay, kind of like a greenish gray. What do you think is associated with the concept of pale or green? If you see somebody who's green, what do you think? They're sick. Okay. They're about to, I mean, we have green-faced emojis on our phones, and what is it depicting? People who are about to upchuck, right? Okay, that's what's being described there. And it's this concept of sickness and death. That's why it's that color. And the interesting thing, especially in Revelation, death and Hades are always together. And they're personified here, not that they are real people, okay, because they're not, but they're states of, I guess you could say, states of existence from the perspective of physical and spiritual. Remember we talked before in Revelation 1, Jesus was given the keys of what? He had the keys of what? Keys of what? Yes, keys of the kingdom, but he was also given the keys of Hades and of death. Okay? And we talked before about having, what does that mean, having keys of Hades and of death? Well, Hades is the spiritual realm where all souls go when they die. Good or evil, every soul goes to Hades. There is no soul, human soul in heaven. There is no human soul in hell right now. Everyone goes to this place called Hades. It's called Sheol in the Old Testament, or the pit is kind of the physical aspect of the grave. Well, Hades is separated into two parts. You have paradise, what Jesus called Abraham's bosom, which tells us Abraham's there, because he was describing Lazarus as enjoying company with Abraham himself in this place of paradise. He told the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. Versus, and remember, when he told the thief, today you'll be with me in paradise, does that mean that Jesus went to heaven and then came back and then ascended into heaven again? Would that make any sense? No. Okay, Jesus went to paradise, was raised from the dead, walked around for 40 days, and then ascended to heaven. That's where he is now. All right, so those who have died faithful to the Lord, both under the patriarchal law, the Mosaical law, the law of Christ, they're in this place of paradise. Those who have been evil and wicked, those who have not been faithful to the Lord, are in a place of torment, like the rich man. Whereas death describes the physical state. It's the state of being dead, of being in the grave, of the pit. That's why we have those references to Sheol and the pit in the Old Testament. It describes both the spiritual state and the physical state of a person. Well, the fact that Jesus has been given the keys of Hades and of death speaks to what ultimate event?
Overcoming, controlling.
Okay. Overcoming the world, conquering the resurrection. All right? It's not just going to be our souls, but what else will be raised and then changed? Our bodies. Okay, our bodies. We will be raised and then we will be changed. Just as Jesus, it's not that his body was left in the tomb and Jesus was an apparition kind of walking around like Casper. His whole body was raised. He invited Thomas to touch the holes in his hands. Well, we will too be raised and changed into that spiritual form, just as Jesus did when he ascended in Acts chapter 1. His physical form was changed into that spiritual form. Well, here in verse 8, what's being described is death, and then Hades is following along. I kind of think that's interesting here, because usually it's Hades and death is referenced. Here it's death. He is the writer, but Hades is following him. What does that kind of convey? What does that convey? You have death and then Hades. The body dies, and then what happens to the soul? It goes to Hades. Okay, that's what happens. It conveys that this happens and then this happens. The body dies, and then the soul goes to Hades. So here's death and Hades, and it is claiming people. But even more specifically, okay, over a fourth of the earth. It's not claiming the whole earth. It's claiming a portion. Now, what would that represent? What do you think this represents? The fact that death and Hades, and it is allowed to them to kill on the earth, and notice the means, with sword, with hunger, with death. Some translations have pestilence or disease here, and beasts of the earth.
Well, it's all physical.
Okay, it's all physical, and it's a result of wars. Okay, there's your sword. Wars are going to happen. Hunger, famine. Okay, sometimes this is translated famine. What often accompanies wars is famine. Death or pestilence, disease also comes with wars and famine. And then beasts of the earth. When society begins to break down, what happens? The protection that is afforded in whether it's safety by numbers or by having individuals hunting or whatever, those dangerous beasts then are able to kind of creep in and infringe upon those who are left alive. And without protection, they're kind of left to the elements, so to speak. What's being described here is difficult life. And it's going to be difficult for everyone. This is not just Christians per se. This is going to be difficult for everybody. This is what life is going to be like on the earth. Now, it's not saying that it's going to be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Okay, but what's going to take place is there's going to be war. There's going to be people who are going to be hungry. There's going to be people who are going to have disease. There's going to be people who the elements are going to claim. Death and Hades accompanies. They're there. Death claims the body. Hades claims the soul. Now, that's the function of, that's life. That's what happens in this life. But what's that in contrast to? This is going to be contrasted to what? Heaven. What's going to happen at heaven? What's that going to be like? None of this is going to exist. Go ahead, Snoop.
Well, I'm just going to say, I agree that, what you said about the beast, but if we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, those men had kind of turned into beasts.
True.
So man kills man, not just in war, but,
Sure.
other ways too. And you think about what's going on. I don't pay attention to news, but I know there's unrest in the Middle East and places like that. And you see all of that.
Yeah.
You see war, you see
People acting like animals.
people not being able to eat.
Yeah.
You see, it's just living on the earth.
Right. Yeah. I think here in verse 8, I think what he's being described is, I think it is figurative in the sense that beasts on the earth, I don't think it's just limited to that.
Right.
Certainly, just it's describing the state of life, what the world is going to be like for these saints and what they're going to have to face. Okay, and it's not just going to afflict them. Obviously, everybody's going to be afflicted by this state of the world. But people are going to go through this. And the saints are they going to be protected from all of this? Is there any point at this where God says, but I won't let you be affected by the famine or the wars or anything else? No, they're going to be just as susceptible as everybody else, if not more so, because, some of these wars are going to be against Christians. Some of these wars are the attempt to persecute saints from Domitian. That's what's happening right now when John's being given this revelation from the Lord. It's this active persecution from Domitian. And even Jesus references the fact that you've gone through persecution, but you're going to go through even more. With some of these churches of Asia, he addresses the fact what you're about to face even worse than what you've already faced. Okay, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Well, this is describing the state of the world that people are going to be living in and what they're going to have to deal with. Not as if, and certainly for the saints are the ones that are reading this. The world doesn't, they don't care. The saints read this though, but notice how in verse 8, power was given to them. Not that God causes wars or that God causes hunger or anything like that, disease, but what? He allows it. Okay, that's the nature of the world, and even more specifically, especially when it comes to what comes from wars and actions of men, God allows man to make their own choices. And the choice of, for instance, Domitian, as he's persecuting the saints, God is not going to intervene and all of a sudden come to Domitian and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. God's going to allow those who are in charge to make their decisions and make their choices. And innocent people always suffer. Always. That's the nature of life. It's not fair. From a human's perspective, it's not fair. But it's not supposed to be fair. Nobody ever said the world is supposed to be fair. But God allows this to happen. And there's a key component there in helping these saints to remember that it's not that God has lost control. And it's not that God has taken his hands off and he's not paying any attention any longer. Does God see everything that happens as we talked about last week? Absolutely. Nothing escapes his attention. Nothing happens without his allowing it to. That's not the same as his making it happen or being a proponent of it happening, but he allows men to make their choices. He allows nature to take its course, and that's going to affect everyone, and the saints need to remember that God hasn't forgotten you. God isn't turning his back on you because you're suffering great persecution, or there's great famine in your area, or there's great disease going on. It's not that God has forgotten you or doesn't choose to see you. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this kind of drives home for me the power that Christ had over death, because death does have power, and we can turn into any of those things. And we're susceptible to the power of all of those things. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's a reminder that while death may have power in those negative things, we see people in our world every day with those kinds of things going on. Our King, our victor, is stronger than death.
Yeah.
So to put our hope in our vision and all of the positive things in our life, to know that the power that God has over death.
Well, and that kind of leads to the point that what's going to ultimately happen to death and Hades? Where are they going to be put at the end of Revelation? Where are we told that they're thrown?
Eternal fire.
Into the lake of fire. Okay, that's where they're going to be thrown. And that goes to show that victory, that total domination over death and Hades. Those things do not have power independent of God. God allows those things to happen. God allows physical death to take place by a myriad of different ways. And then God has ordained this place where souls go to wait. But one day, when the judgment of the world comes, when the Lord returns and brings us to judgment, will there be any soul left in Hades?
No.
Will anybody be forgotten there? No. Will any human body be left on earth? Will anybody be forgotten? No. No one will. Everyone, both good and evil, Jesus says, will come to judgment. They will all be raised. Some will be raised to everlasting life, others to everlasting condemnation. Anything else to verse 8? Verse 9. All right, so now we have the fifth seal. Now this is the end of the four creatures inviting John to come and see what's going to happen. Now we have kind of a little bit of a turn to the reaction of these four events, of the spreading of the gospel, of the persecution of the saints, of the weighing of the hearts, the testing of the hearts, and certainly the economic hardship. and of the wars and the things, the type of society that the Christians are facing and dealing with. Now, what's the reaction? How is this affecting them? Well, here in verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. Now, John sees specifically, where are they? Where are they? Under the altar. Okay, he doesn't see them on the altar, he sees them under the altar. Well, what was the altar? Whether we're talking about Old Testament, New Testament, what's an altar?
Place to make sacrifices to God.
Okay, a place where sacrifices were made, where blood was spilt. Okay, in fact, the term in the Old Testament, literally the place of blood. All right, this is where the blood was spilt. So that's the physical part of it. But then what happens specifically, as we're talking about people here, we're talking about the souls of people. They are under the altar, representing that this is what they died for. They served at the altar of the Lord in the service to the temple of God, so to speak, metaphorically, but they were killed on the altar. Speaking of, in their service to God, they were put to death. In fact, this is specifically defined for us, those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. Okay, we would refer to these as martyrs. The term martyr doesn't necessarily carry, in the Greek term doesn't necessarily carry one who has died for the cause of Christ. It's one who is an eyewitness, one who testifies, this is what happened. The idea of a martyr, however, in the New Testament is linked to suffering because of the cause of Christ. All right, you don't necessarily have to die to be a martyr, but that's kind of the modern definition it has. These are all individuals who have died because of their faith in Jesus Christ. Now, what John's seeing, though, is those who have died, but this isn't limited to just those who have, but who would die as well. Okay, anyone who would die in the cause of Christ. Because notice what they're crying out in verse 10. How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So this is what they're asking. Now keep in mind, this is not literal. There's not a literal altar in heaven and God somehow stores all these souls under this altar so that he can remember who died because of the cause and who didn't. All right, it's symbolic. It's representation of these individuals who died for the cause of Christ. And there is some awareness here. Okay, we talk about what's it like, what is paradise going to be like? My grandfather was absolutely convinced that he was going to sleep when he got to paradise. If you want to sleep and God lets you sleep, that's fine. You want to sleep, that's your, he was always wanting to sleep. He only slept like 3 hours a night anyway, so he was always tired. And he wanted to sleep. All right, you sleep. I will rest, however, when I get there, because I want to talk to Abraham, and I want to talk to Moses, I want to talk to David. All right, hopefully I'm allowed to do that. But we don't know exactly what that's going to be like. We do know, for instance, Lazarus was greatly comforted. The fact that Jesus called it Abraham's bosom suggests there is some sense of awareness. Okay, some sense of awareness that I'm being comforted by Father Abraham in the case of Lazarus. Well, here we have individuals who have died. And again, it could just be, it may not necessarily be specifically stating to the effect that these individuals are literally aware in some form or fashion in paradise, but they are speaking out. They are saying, we've died for the cause of the Lord. How long? And notice they acknowledge, they're not blaming God. They're not in any way insinuating God is taking too long. That is not to be taken from verse 10. Okay, they're not accusing God of dragging his feet. They say, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood? They're just wondering. They're not in any more pain now. Okay, they're not in sorrow anymore. They're in a place of paradise. But they're asking God, how long will this continue? How long until these terrible, wicked people are brought to judgment? Go ahead, Snoop.
For me, this is very motivational because, like, sometimes when you're walking your Christian faith, you feel down, you struggle, and I think about the people that I love who have passed, fellow Christians, my family, and even the apostles, and I think, you know what, they're watching me, and they did it, besides just being with God, to be reunited with those souls. So to me, this is very encouraging and edifying to know that they're already together.
Yeah.
And I can go there as well if I remain true
Right.
to Christ.
Absolutely. And, the key component here, of course, specifically, John is seeing those who have died for the cause of Christ. That's not to say that those who've died for the cause of Christ are somewhere else other than paradise. They're not. Okay, as Snoop said, they're all in the same place. But it's also important to note that they're not crying for revenge. And there's a very important differentiation between avenge, verse 10, judge and avenge, versus seeking revenge. Avengement is seeking justice and punishment for wrongdoing. Okay, that's what that is. When Paul recalled to mind, and I want to say it was it Alexander the coppersmith or Demetrius? I always get those confused. But anyway, or the silversmith, the one who caused him great sorrow and great pain. He says, God will, or may God render unto him his works. Okay? And some people read that as if Paul's being somehow vengeful. He's being, mean and cruel somehow. May God repay him for what he's done. And yet, seeking to be avenged is simply seeking justice for wrongdoing. Whereas revenge is retaliation to get back at, to get even. And it usually contains malice and hate. At any point, Old or New Testaments, are the people of God ever called to take revenge in the sense of malice and hate towards others? No, not at all. In fact, God says, and even when we talk about vengeance itself, who does vengeance belong to? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And that's reiterated both in the Old and New Testaments. Vengeance is mine. I don't have the right to avenge myself. Therefore, I rely on God to do that for me. That's why he's called holy and true, because his judgment is righteous. His judgment is objective, whereas mine, the line can get very blurry between seeking to be avenged versus seeking revenge. That line can get very blurry and murky in a hurry if I'm left to deal out or mete out vengeance. Vengeance belongs to God because he can be objective. He's holy and he's true. And he fulfills everything he says he's going to do. And has he said he's going to bring vengeance on those who trouble his people? Yes. He has said that. Okay. Now I can make that promise, but either whether or not I intend to fulfill that or not, some things can get in the way. I may not be able to do that. God, however, nothing's going to get in his way. Go ahead, Snoop.
Well, in my head, avenge, I don't have a lot of emotion with avenge, other than I'm going to allow God to take care of it or let the natural repercussions happen.
Right.
With revenge, I'm actively engaged. I am repaying. I am angry. There's a lot of negative emotion with revenge, and we're told to control our temper. So, revenge for a Christian should be the last thing that they think about.
Right.
Avenge, and there's some satisfaction in avengement in that you don't have to do anything, but they will answer for what they have done.
And there's a key component there too. It's not that I enjoy seeing people, especially of God, okay, let's be more specific here, of being God bringing judgment on people. That shouldn't bring me the sense of satisfaction of enjoyment, okay, because how much easily could I have been in their place, right? So it's not that I'm so much better than you, I get to watch you be judged. That's not the mind of the saints here in verse 10. Okay, this is simply justice for punishment for what was done to them. That's all. And it doesn't take into account any kind of sense of enjoyment or perverse pleasure. It's simply the acknowledgement that God has promised vengeance, and they're simply asking, how long? When will this happen? Again, not arguing, not complaining that it's taking too long or that God's dragging his feet. Just how much longer? is this going to happen? How much longer until the end of these things will be?
One of the ways I've dealt with it is when people have, said bad things about me or untrue things about myself is, to myself I say, they will stand before the Lord one day and know that what they're saying is not true.
Yeah.
And that's a very calming thing for me, like, I don't have to deal with it.
Right.
Because
It's
God
not your
has-
responsibility.
No, God has my back, I will answer for me, and one day they're gonna have to stand before God and answer for
Right.
what they've done. So I'm not wishing them any ill harm, I just know judgment.
That's a part of putting our cares on the Lord.
Yeah, I know one day they're gonna answer, no matter how much harm they might cause me,
Mm-hmm.
and untruths they might say about me, I don't have to concern myself.
And we need to make sure we don't fall into the same trap they have.
Exactly,
That we somehow create hardship or stumbling blocks for others.
right.
All right, any other thoughts to that? Yes, sir.
Was that there is, this isn't a calm, our Lord.
No, they're crying out with a loud voice.
A loud voice.
Yes.
So there's some, I don't know what the right word is, but there's some strong intent there
Sure,
in the question.
sure. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. They're crying out with a loud voice. It's not, again, and like you said, I'm not sure what the term in great interest and in great eagerness, I guess, is to understand what the plan of the Lord is, how he's going to bring this about, when is this going to happen. But it's not blaming God. It's not condemning him or complaining. And I wouldn't say this is some perverse pleasure in seeking to watch it necessarily. But it is sin. Again, it goes back to that sense of justice for what's happened. Yes, ma'am.
Well, if you were one of those people under there, and you were watching your children and your grandchildren being persecuted, you would cry out very loud.
Sure, sure.
'Cause you don't-
And of course, whether or not they're able to see that, I don't know. I can't say
Yeah.
for sure, but
Well,
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know the persecution's still going on.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And
The verse it's about their own blood.
yes, this is our blood on those who dwell on the earth. And these are still this, and it's not necessarily physically these individuals who physically hurt me, individually, but the systems that took place. Again, Rome is under consideration here specifically, but also, I mean, in some of the churches of Asia, we know that the Jews were at the hands of persecution to the saints. So, I mean, it's not just limited to Rome, and certainly through time, it has not been limited to Rome. This is taking into account all of it, for sure. Then verse 11, a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed. Now, all right, so verse 11 is the response, God's response, or the response to these saints asking how much longer will this be allowed to happen? How much longer until vengeance is taken? We'll talk about God's response next week. I'll also have chapter 7 notes available next week on the back table and in your emails, so that we'll be ready for chapter 7 when we get there. Thank you, everybody.